Good evening, everyone. My name is Chi Isiagu. I've had the pleasure of meeting several of you, but I want to introduce myself as the Adult Program Director for the JCC. I'm so excited that we have revived our partnership with ASU Jewish Studies Department, and we're putting these quality programs on together. Welcome to everyone on Zoom, as well as the people here in the room. So I'd like to introduce Hava Tirosh Samuelson. She is the Director of Jewish Studies and Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. Welcome, Hava.
So good evening, everyone, to those who are with us here at the JCC and to people online. Since you already heard my titles, I don't need to repeat it. As you know, Jewish Studies at ASU is engaged not only in teaching courses about Jewish history, the Jewish religion, Jewish culture, but also we have a very robust adult education program. This is just an example of it. And we do a lot of it online, not all of it, but a lot of it is online. And tomorrow at 7 o'clock, we have the third lecture in the series about Josephus. So if you're interested, please, you can still join us online. It's going to be an online only program. And it has been really very rewarding. This evening, we're very fortunate and really quite honored to host Professor Alon Tal from Tel Aviv University, who is currently a visiting professor at Stanford University. His topic, as you know, is the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the subtitle is Finding a Path Forward. Now, the title may seem a little bit odd to you, to all of us, because Israel is still in the midst of a war against Hamas. And Hamas, as many of you know, has launched a major attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Over 1,200 people were killed. Women and girls were raped, babies massacred, homes were looted, property destroyed in 27 settlements in Otef Gaza, and over 200 people were taken hostages. And among them were men, women, and children, Israelis as well as foreign nationals. So this was a very difficult experience for all the people involved. As you know, over 100 people, about 136, are still in captivity. We hope that they will be returned to Israel soon. But of course, we don't know when the war will be over and how it will end. So although the current reality is one of war, Israel is not about perpetual wars, not interested in war. Rather, Israel is very interested and desires peaceful coexistence with her neighbors, both Arabs and Palestinians. And the vision is to see the Middle East as an area that prospers. So how can that be achieved? How can there be a sustainable peace and not only a temporary ceasefire? What should be done so that the prophetic vision of peace will become a livable and a lived reality? No one, I think, here in America or in Israel is better equipped to answer those questions than our guest, Professor Alon Tal. Let me briefly tell you a little bit about his career, and it's an unusual career because it's both academic as well as career in politics and in public service. So he was born in the United States, got his initial training, a BA in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also got a law degree in Hebrew University, and then went back to the United States and got a PhD at Harvard University in environmental health policy. If you want to know about environmentalism in Israel, I highly recommend that you read his wonderful books that are really foundational, seminal text. The first famous book is Pollution in the Promised Land and Environmental History in Israel. In my view, it's a must read. He has several other books that were written thereafter. One book about, the title is All the Trees of the Forest, Israel's Woodland from Antiquity to the Present. That's an example of environmental history in Israel. He has another major concern of his is overpopulation in Israel. That's a book that he published in 2016. The Land is Full, Addressing Overpopulation in Israel. He also has a book about food scarcity, and he has the most recent book is on climate change. That's a book that appeared in 2021. So all this is very relevant to peace issues because you can learn actually from the environment how ecosystems work and how you always have to talk about interconnectedness and interdependence. So I won't give you all the organizations that he was involved in Israel as an environmentalist. I'll mention maybe two of them. One is Adam Teva Vadin, which is Israel Union of Environmental Defense. He founded that organization. He also created and led the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. He created also the Green Zionist Alliance, grassroots campaign for sustainable Israel. So you're dealing here with a person who is really a truly environmental activist. But he doesn't only doing it as a person who is involved in organizations, he also entered into politics. And most recently in 2021, 2022, he was a member of Kahol Lavan. If you know that particular party, which was combined, it's a combination of two political entities. One was Hosan LeIsrael, which is the Israel Resilience Party that combined with Yesh Atid, and together they created the blue-white party, the Kahol Lavan party. Today they are going under the title of Machaneh Mamlachti, the national camp. But who knows, maybe they will go back to the old name. You never know in Israeli politics. It's very, very changing. All this is very relevant because he understands how the Knesset works. He understands how politics is done, how Israeli politics, it's based on coalitions of parties that are really constantly shifting and moving in terms of who has the power and who is leading what. So he knows it from within, and he's going to share some of this information and how it's relevant to the future of Israel as far as the peace in the Middle East. One word of caution that I'm going to ask for all of you, whether you are here with us in person or online. We are dealing with topics that that can generate contestation and some disagreement, of course. And because people have different perceptions, different knowledge, different experiences, I ask all of you here in the room and online to treat each other and to treat Professor Tal with respect and civility. So questions are very welcome. We'll take them and he will answer everything that is presented to him, but I ask that we remain civil toward each other. So please listen attentively to Professor Tal. And if you are on Zoom, just put your questions, if you could, on the Q&A function. And then we'll somehow manage, maybe Lisa, you'll give us the questions from the Zoom and we'll get it all done. So thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Good evening. Thank you, Chava, for the warm introduction. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And for what I understand is the 100 Zoomers out there, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tonight, but I also first of all want to acknowledge that yesterday was by far the most painful day in the recent war. Israel lost 21 soldiers. And for those of us who are Israeli, any loss, including innocent Palestinian loss, is mourned, but it was a particularly hard day. And I think it would, given the fact that we're at a JCC, we can acknowledge that sacrifice that was made. I also want to acknowledge that tomorrow we issue in the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, the so-called Jewish Arbor Day, the birthday of the trees. And I would be remiss at a Jewish studies gathering not to talk about this. And although it might seem that it's anomalous, it doesn't exactly connect in the topic, I hope that I'll manage to segue through, and in this general issue of indigenousness or indigeneity, if I'm calling it specifically, you'll see how it fills in. So just bear with me as I open with a few comments about Tu B'Shvat, the holiday of the tree. So in the Mishnah, the opening book of the Talmud, there are 4 New Year's in the Jewish calendar. We have the New Year's for kings and festivals and for tithing cattle and for counting years, but we also have the New Year's for the trees, and that is on the 15th day of Shvat, the Jewish month of Shvat. Now, if you actually look at the text, you'll see that there's a debate there because there are two major rabbinic schools who are active 2,000 years ago. One of them is the Academy of Hillel, and the other one is of Shammai. And Hillel says, well, we know when the New Year's of the trees is. It's the 15th day of Shvat. And Shammai says, no, it's the first day of Shvat. Now, it would be the most obvious explanation, or at least the one that would seem the most simple to say, oh, this is just a couple of very, very meticulous or obsessive rabbis arguing over minutia of this. But in fact, it's been pointed out there might be something far more profound there about this debate of whether it's the first of Shvat or the 15th. You know, in Israel, it's a Mediterranean climate, so it rains about 6 months of the year, and it is dry 6 months of the year. California has that. There's several places with Mediterranean climates. So there is a rainy season in Israel, and generally, according to our calendar, in the month of Tishrei and Sukkot, we issue in the rainy season, and then when Passover comes, we welcome the Jew, which means the rain is done. Now, if you want to understand this notion of when do we plant trees, you have to understand a little bit about Israeli meteorology. Because in those days, when you want to plant trees, you want to try to time the planting exactly in the middle of the rainy season, when the land is no longer dry and parched, has enough there to receive the seedlings, and yet it is still enough rain to come along the way to coax along the seedlings and let them grow. So presumably that was the objective in the rabbis when they were trying to think about when the trees would come. Now, think about the rain patterns in Israel. We have a lot of very big rainstorms these days. Climate change has come and all of it. It's extreme rain patterns, but typically the heaviest rains in the coast come early on. In October, November, you'll always hear the Alon Highway in Tel Aviv is closed. We have a major storm, whatever. And as the season goes on, the heavy rains tend to move a little bit to the east, and Jerusalem gets its heavy share of this. So when we think about it, the middle of the rainy season depends on where you live. And indeed, the Academy of Shammai was based in Ramla near the coast, and Hillel was up in the hills. So basically what you had was a geographic debate about where the center, the heartland, the capital of the Jewish world was. Is it in the coast or is it up in Jerusalem? And of course, Hillel won and Jerusalem became the capital. And you could argue that even today, that argument exists. Is Tel Aviv, with all of its nightlife and the city that never goes to sleep, is that Israel's epicenter, or is it Jerusalem, which is more somber and spiritual, okay? And I say this because it's often been noticed that if you really want to understand the Bible and the Talmud, you have to know the land of Israel. It's impossible to understand it without understanding the basic geographical and meteorological and topographical elements. And only then can you really understand what's going on. We'll get back to that in a second. The second thing I want to tell is maybe the most common story of Tu B'Shvat. At least every Israeli school child gets it from first grade and probably every year after. And that is the story of Honi the circle maker, Honi HaMagel. Honi HaMagel was a idiosyncratic rabbi, sort of a bohemian type, if you ask me, who lived 2,000 years ago. He got his unconventional name as a circle maker because when there was a drought in Israel, he drew a circle in the sand, according to legend, and he stepped inside of it and he told God, I am not leaving the sand until you give us rain. And he was successful. The rain started to come. And then they tell the story, there were some rabbis a little bit critical. That sort of audaciousness was interpreted as maybe a chutzpah. You don't start making conditions for the Almighty. But the editors of the Talmud left it in and seemed to feel that this sort of interesting rabbi had a special relationship with his creator. So now the Tu B'Shvat story that goes is this, that Honi, the circle maker, was walking down the road one day and he sees a guy planting a carob tree. And he turns to him in a somewhat cynical fashion and says, really? How long is it going to take for this carob tree to give fruit? And the guy said, 70 years, I think. He said, and you think that you're going to live long enough to get the fruit? And he said, well, I was born into land with carob trees that were planted to me by my fathers and grandfathers, and so I'm going to plant them for the future generations. And then the legend continues that he sat down to have a bite to eat and he fell asleep. And this is where he becomes sort of the Rip Van Winkle of Jewish tradition. He wakes up and he sees somebody picking carobs from the carob tree. He said, you the guy who planted the tree? He says, no, I am his son's son. And then he realizes it. Now, the message of this story to me is very, very clear, that the Jewish people of the land of Israel back then had a very strong and basic connection to the land and thought in intergenerational terms, which is one of the characteristics of indigenous people, that you are there and you know that your great-great-grandparents are there and your great-grandchildren are going to be there, and that's how it's going to be. And I say that because as an environmentalist, over the years, I've seen my share of environmental documentaries. And frequently, when you look at these ones that are taking place, particularly if you're an environmental activist like me, in some so-called, primitive lands or lands that are not as developed, and you see communities in the Amazon standing in front of bulldozers and not letting them plow down this forest in the Amazon, or entire villages in India who are standing in front of their valley and not letting them flood the valley to make this new dam. Because, and you say, where do they get that temerity from? Where do they get the chutzpah to stand up? And it comes down to what I think is called literature a sense of place. That for those people who live in the Amazon, have been there, for them, their connection to the trees is an organic connection. They could no more cut down a tree than they could cut off their arm, okay? Because they know those trees were there to support their ancestors, and their children will also enjoy those trees. And the same is true for those kind of people. And when I moved to Israel, it always felt to me that when I distilled down the Zionist impulse which brought me there, it was my desire as a Jewish individual to reclaim my status as an indigenous person. I liked North Carolina, where I was growing up. It's a great city there. My friend Stephen can attest that I don't think I encountered any prejudice or problems there. I was president of my high school class and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't home. I didn't have that sense of connection. Now, why is all this relevant to our discussion about Israel's and Palestine and our ability to work things out in the future? We find ourselves enmeshed in a very, very painful conflict. Didn't start on October 7th, although that was certainly a new chapter. It started 100 years ago, at least, okay? And when I try to think about the path of the way forward, I try to think about what changed in October 7th in terms of my own feelings towards working. And I say this as somebody, I talked about it more this afternoon in a presentation, as somebody who's been working in peacemaking and environmental cooperation for some 30 years. But I think that part of the problem is that for over the years, we were willing to compromise on this notion of managing the conflict as opposed to resolving the conflict. And I think we need to be honest with each other about what we want if we're going to actually move forward towards some sort of a peaceful solution and not go back to the last 100 years of yet another and another round, because the price has simply become too high, both for the Israelis and certainly for the people of Gaza, who have suffered so terribly during the past few months. So I want to speak about three things that I would like to expect from Palestinian leadership as we move forward, which I hope will be after this war is done, towards talking about, maybe it'll take a while, I don't know if it'll be peace now, but moving to some sort of peaceful reconciliation. And there's three things that matter to me. It's maybe not the only things, but I think that they're relevant now. One of them, I think it's time that the Palestinians recognize the Jewish people's standing as an indigenous people in the land of Israel. They recognize our indigeneity, okay? I'll get into that in a second. The second thing I'd like for them to do is to stop this assault on truth, this very, very flippant attitude with historical facts and creating all kinds of fictions, mostly very hateful and harmful fictions. And the third thing is accept a Jewish presence in the Middle East, accept the fact that in a large Muslim world, there could be a small sliver of land in which a Jewish people could live. So to begin with this issue of indigeneity, I started with all these Tu B'Shvat stories to kind of give you a sense of how important it is. And when you think about it, there's no more, I think, symbolic act for indigenous people than to plant trees, okay? That means that you are invested in the land. When you are renting out an apartment, you don't plant, you don't work on your garden. When you live in a land and you know you're gonna live there, you expect your great-grandchildren to be there, just like the story of Honi Ma'agel, you expect somebody to do that kind of thing. And one of the things that happened in the last, I don't know, decades when we have discussions with Palestinians, there is a constant refusal to accept that notion. And this sort of fake news that, no Jews really actually came to Israel until 1948 has been, I think, much more toxic in its long-term implications than any of us imagined. Now, in the peace camp, people tended to be tolerant when they heard these kind of arguments. You would go and have a discussion, and the people would be looking at the Jews as some sort of interlopers, refusing to accept that there had ever been a Jewish presence there or a Jewish kingdom, whatever. And frequently people accepted it. In fact, I look back at some of the conversations I had, and I said, just move on. It's just rhetoric. And I was complacent or whatever. And I said, we need to go on with the serious peacemaking. There's even, I think, a lot of Jews who tried to, I don't say necessarily hide, but play down their Zionist identity, lest it stir up discomfort and turbulence on the other side. I think today that's changed. I think today Israelis are pushing back. And I think we all need to push back against that kind of a narrative. And the reason, to me, I find, because I'm on campus now, I'm at Stanford, as you feel how much this has festered and morphed into a new rhetoric, which is highly, I would say, questionable. But it's particularly common amongst leftist intellectuals in certain disciplines, which basically see the world as two kinds of people, victims and settler colonials. And Jews must be settler colonials because, well, they invent the facts. So I personally, when I look back at my own family's history here in Israel, I have a great-great-grandfather who is buried in Sfat in 1870, okay? I don't know how many Americans can show me where their great-great-grandfather was born in 1870. And I don't feel like I'm an interloper, not even a little bit. So that's the first place that I'd like to expect a change and a recognition and stop feeding lies to a liberal academia, which passes them on, which would suggest that the Jews have no place in the state of Israel, and the river to the sea, that kind of a rhetoric is not helpful. That is only going to make us push back further and be radicalized. So that's the first thing I expect. You have to accept that we were there at some point, and it's not just some sort of historical injustice. The second thing that I would expect of Palestinians today, as I sit down in the negotiation, is to chill down on the lies. One of the things, there's a booth of Palestinian propaganda, I guess you could say, at Stanford. And one of the things that you hear often is October 7th, how do you know it actually happened? It probably didn't happen. Well, let me tell you this. When I was a member of the Knesset, I was there for 2 years, and I made many friends. And when I got out, I stayed in touch with the Knesset in different contexts. After October 7th, the Knesset had a problem. There were a lot of funerals, 1,300 funerals. And they wanted to send, as is traditional, a representative of the Knesset as a national body, because that's what you do, both to the funeral and to the Shiva, to the period of mourning there. And there weren't enough people to do it. First of all, they weren't enough because most of the people killed were very, very angry at the government. So actually the ruling parties, their people didn't feel comfortable because they were getting yelled out of this. And Arabs didn't necessarily feel comfortable at the time. It was a little bit awkward, ultra-Orthodox. And anyway, they needed to bring in the reservists. Since I spent a lot of time visiting families of the fallen and going to funerals. So those people who say that October 7th didn't happen, let me tell you, I saw the bodies go in the ground. It happened. And when you hear that kind of brazen flippancy with the truth, it doesn't engender goodwill. Neither does it engender goodwill when you hear the representatives of Hamas. I'm talking about Ghazi Hamad's famous interview. If you saw it, he's the representative of Hamas in Lebanon, where he said, "We are going to do it again and again and again." I don't think that's helpful. The other thing that bothers me is the misuse and inappropriate use of the word apartheid, okay? I mean, if you want to know about apartheid, I highly recommend Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime. South Africa was an apartheid state. But in what universe is what happens in Israel and even remotely similar to South Africa? I invite anybody who would make that argument to spend a week visiting Arab communities and going there. I mean, in Israel, Arabs ride on all of the same buses and trains as Jews do. They go to the same beaches. They attend the same movie theaters. They go to the same restaurants. They go to the same universities. The best attorneys in the Arab community become judges, even Supreme Court judges. The best economists become heads of banks. In fact, Bank Leumi, our national bank, the director general is an Arab-Israeli citizen. They are players in the Knesset. Without them, Israel's health system wouldn't function because they're, I think, a disproportionately large amount of them. And so one of the good things, I mean, you don't want to look for silver linings after such a horrible tragedy of October 7th. But one of the things that happened was Arab Israelis all of a sudden realized that they had to face a choice. And they chose being with Israel with all its flaws. Israel's got problems with minorities like anybody else and whatever, but they realized that they don't want to be in the Palestinian side. And that's particularly true of the Bedouin community. It remains, I mean, there's still hostages who are Bedouins, but the atrocities that were applied weren't necessarily just to Jews, they were to Israelis. And the Arabs realized that, and so I believe they're with us. In any event, I think we need to have a much more honest discussion about the status of Israel, and as a country which can accept minorities there. And the third topic subject I'd like to make is talk about accepting the Jewish presence in Israel. One of the things that I think most Israelis have changed in their perspective, and I'm talking about the leftist peace camp, with whom I think I was largely affiliated for my career, is that it was always a sense that if we could only deal with the issue of the territories, the same territories that Israel conquered in 1967, and work that out, we would have peace with the Arabs. And I think what October 7th left us feeling is, no, it's not about 1940, it's not about 1967, it's about 1948. It's about actually whether or not there's ever been a willingness on the side of Palestinians to accept a Jewish presence. Israeli Arab citizens accept that. But the sense is that I haven't seen a single Palestinian leader who acknowledges any responsibility for the Nakba, the terrible tragedy which befell the Palestinian people when they lost the war that they initiated against the Jews, and unwillingness to accept that, yes, in the long term, there's going to have to be a Jewish state here. This was something, those words never really could come out of Yasser Arafat's mouth and subsequent leaders at all. So this is something which is very important. I want to make the other additional point that when I hear arguments that say, well, you know, Palestinians are really trying to do civil disobedience and promote BDS. What is BDS? BDS' goal is to destroy the state of Israel. Let's be honest about that. So the tactics may be different, but the outcome is the same. And if we're really serious about sitting and trying to create a new Middle East where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side, there has to be a willingness to accept a Jewish national presence. Now, that's what I expect from the Palestinians, what I expect from us. I mean, we have to be both sides. The first thing I want to say is that Israelis need to drop any sense of, I would say, superiority in playing the indigenous card. In other words, the Palestinians have a narrative, and we need to respect their narrative. There's, you know, people say, well, there was only 300,000 Palestinians back. No, they have it. I've always felt that Palestinians have a deep connection to the land. Their connection and commitment to their and willingness is not unlike ours in the sort of certain indigenous things. And we need to accept that and respect that. And that's very, very important. The other thing we have to do is really, really think about Israel's future as a country and its, how would I put it, application of the theory of the iron wall. Okay. Now, what is the iron wall? I don't know how many of you heard about it. The iron wall is a very, very famous essay by the Zionist thinker Zev Vladimir Jabotinsky. In my family, he has great cachet. My grandfather, of blessed memory, was a devotee of Jabotinsky. It's a weird story, so I'm going to open up parentheses and share the story. When he was 14 years old, living in a shtetl in Poland, my grandfather needed to go to Warsaw to buy shoes, so the family lore goes. And he got on the train, and they were terribly, terribly poor. And they went on the train. He went on the train, and he walks over to somebody sitting there and says, "Excuse me, aren't you Zev Vladimir Jabotinsky, the iconic Zionist revisionist leader?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "What are you doing here? This is the people's train. I mean, you should be sitting in first class. You're famous. And he says, "When I travel at the expense of the Jewish people." And so, of course, I travel in people's class. And that very day, my grandfather left his Zionist movement, which at the time was the leftist Hashomer Tzir, and joined Beitar and the right-wing revisionists because it was so inspired by him. But when I would argue, and I argued frequently with my grandfather with wonderful love and things, we would argue about some of Jabotinsky's ideas. Jabotinsky's, maybe his ultimate essay was called The Iron Wall. And what did he say in The Iron Wall? He said this: those, speaking to the left half of things, those people who believe that the problem with the Palestinians is they don't understand our intentions, they are disingenuous. They're foolish. The Palestinians understand our intentions very, very well. They don't want to accept it now. And he said, we could understand why they don't want to accept it. And therefore, we need to create an iron wall. We need to be so strong that eventually, over generations, the Arabs in this land will come to accept us being there. And until that time, we have to maintain an iron wall. And I thought about that, of course, on October 7th, when for 3 or 4 hours, that iron wall was breached. The Israeli army failed. The Israeli intelligence failed. And we saw what happened. When the iron wall was breached, we were butchered and we were massacred and beheaded and raped. And we saw a future that validates a lot of my grandfather's concern. Now, my grandfather was from Poland, and he didn't have a lot of love for the Polish people. He always said there's two kinds of Poles: those who want to kill you and those who want to enjoy watching it. And I think a lot of my debates with him in my coming to Israel was that I didn't want to be in that role, that I wanted to get beyond, because he had very much a sense of Jews as victims. And I said, well, Jews are vulnerable. We can't control them, but I don't think that we ever wanted to be victims. And I remember specifically when I was in the army once, lying in a what they call an ambush in Lebanon on my stomach. I was 20 years old, sitting in Lebanon, waiting for terrorists to come through. I was a paratrooper at the time. And I thought about the fact that the father of my grandfather, I'm talking a lot about my ancestors today because it's indigeneity's in the air, but he was shot in his bed by the Nazis because he was too sick to get up and get out of bed. And I thought that it would be unimaginable for him that his great-grandson would have changed his status as a victim and taken the initiative. And that's really what Zionism has allowed us. But we can't take the iron wall too far. I don't think the iron wall means that we, for the rest of eternity, need to be at war with our Arabs. And the reason I feel that way is I look at the Middle East today, and I am encouraged by the fact that the vast majority of Arabs who live in the Middle East live in countries that have diplomatic relations and who have insisted on maintaining those diplomatic relations, even or notwithstanding the very, very painful images that they see every day on their Al Jazeera television screens. In other words, they recognize that in the new organization of powers in the Middle East, where we have the Iranian axis and the moderate axis, Israel has a role to play, and they're on the right side, and they're going to stay with Israel. Okay, and that's a very important thing to say. So what we want to do is make sure that we maintain our deterrence. That is a lesson of October 7th. We can never, ever let down our iron wall, at least not for a very long time, not in my lifetime, I don't think. But at the same time, we have to be open to the fact that the Middle East has changed, okay? And so when we think about a way forward, I think we need to realize that there's good news, that in many ways, the Arab-Israel conflict is over. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict rages on and brings tragedy to both sides. But within the region, 6 countries attacked Israel in 1948, the day after it was established in May 1948. Egypt, well, we've had a peace treaty with them, and it's been pretty robust since 1977. And Jordan, okay, and we're doing all right by them. We still have some problems with Syria, but the point is Saudi Arabia was one of the countries that attacked us. They're about to make peace with us. And they declared even now that they will do so after the war is resolved, something that would have been unimaginable for many, many years. So we have this opportunity to move forward. And when I look at the different peace proposals on the table, I'm actually encouraged by the Saudi American peace proposal that Princess Rima bint Bandar, who's the ambassador to Washington for the Saudi Arabians, put forward, talking about rebuilding Gaza with significant support from neighboring countries. They're going to need that kind of help. Establishing a moderate Palestinian leadership in Gaza. I don't think anybody, or the vast majority of Israelis, do not want to go back and rule over the Gazans. That was not the point of this. This was about our security. It wasn't about reestablishing our political dominance over there. And then ratifying a defense treaty between the US and Saudi Arabia and Israel that will provide an allowance against their mutual foe, Iran. That's something which I think Israelis can get their arms around. And the question is, can the Palestinians get their arm around it? Because I think that they have faced now the same decision that all other countries do in the Middle East. You can go the way of Iran, and you can see the Houthis, what that means for them in terms of a pirate terrorist legacy, or the radical Shiite militias in Iraq, or Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's one model. And we saw how that ended up in Gaza. Not exactly anything that we wanted to do in Israel, another thing that's done been very well for them. Or they can look at the moderate regimes who said, you know what? Israel can be a partner. It can bring a blessing to the Middle East, and let's get on with learning to live together. So I wanted to talk for about a half an hour and leave enough time for a discussion. But I did want to say that when I look at this issue of how do I declare and make it clear of my indigenous status and do my part to contribute to that statement, it is Tu B'Shvat, and this is the time when I think we need to plant trees, more trees. Many trees are burned down because, as you know, we've had thousands of rockets, and people get out of the way, and people have the Iron Dome, but when they fall in open spaces, they fall and they cause all, because we need to go back and plant more trees, and trees, thank heavens, are a renewable resource. And that's what indigenous people do. So I want to wish everybody a happy Tu B'Shvat starting tomorrow evening. And I welcome your comments, suggestions. Hopefully I've been sufficiently provocative to elicit some kind of a conversation in this area.
Okay, so here's how this is going to work.
Before I do anything, I want to thank Lisa and Chava for being such wonderful hosts. It's the second year in a row I've enjoyed meeting with them, and really appreciate everything they've done to make my stay here so comfortable and convenient. So
Thank you. It's been a
that's
pleasure.
Lisa, your MC there.
I'm Lisa. I'm going to be walking around. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come over to you. I do ask you that you phrase it as a question, and that people use this time to ask questions that this lecture may have made them think of, and not give speeches. And the same thing is true for Zoom, which I'm going to be going back and forth, and we're going to get some of the Zoom questions in as well. The people on Zoom also, please ask your questions in the form of questions and not political statements. Thank you.
And of course, state your name.
Thank you. Professor, I always have the feeling, or I've had the feeling or the understanding that the Arab population in Israel is very high. And just from a point of view, environmentally or biologically, this is rising. Whereas the Israeli population or the Jewish population tend to have smaller families and smaller things. Do you feel that there's a possibility that in the future, the Arabs would simply, it would be more than the Jewish population?
Well, the demographics which you describe are absolutely precise for the 1960s or 70s. Today, fake news. Fake news. For 3 years now, Jewish women have had more children than Muslim women, not mentioning Arab women. I mean, Christian Arabs have 1.9 kids, like Europe. The Druze went down from 6.5 children to 2.1. I'm very concerned about overpopulation in Israel. And one of the problems with talking about population and sustainability was this concern that, and it was said by Yasser Arafat that the secret weapon of the Palestinian people is the womb of the Arab mother, or, if we can't beat them in the battlefield, we'll beat them in the bedroom, and those kind of things. And that was very, very, I think, it made it impossible to talk dispassionately about sustainability and stable populations. Today, that's not the case. There's a lot of explanations for why Israeli Arab families have become so much smaller, but I have three.
Money.
Empowering women, and empowering women. And in 1950, a new Jewish state, they did a survey, and about 3% of the Arab Israeli citizens who were women could read and write. 30% of the men, okay? We have to remember that the intelligentsia often left in 1948 for whatever reasons, and those who couldn't leave were stuck there, the falachim, the peasant farmers. Today, go to the Technia and see what percentage of the architecture students, and it's a very, very elite unit, are women. I think 35% are Arab women, okay? So what we've seen is a shift, and as Arab Israeli citizens have taken advantage, it took a while, and there has, in the past, I think there was somewhat systematic discrimination, but as time goes on, I can tell you, as the chair of a department, that we did everything we can to ensure that there are as many Arab students who want to join us as their percentage of the population. I'm talking about affirmative action in those terms, because it's very, very important, I think, that we integrate them. And the great, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say consolations of the last 3 months, is the fact that there was a earlier conflict with Gaza, where the Arab Israelis went to the streets, and they, small groups of them, it was a small minority, but they rioted, and it was a very, very frightening time for Israelis to see that. The Hamas, I think, paradoxically, brought Israeli Arabs closer, and we feel much, much more closer. So I'm not at all worried about Arab demographics. I wish everybody would have fewer children in Israel, but Arabs are on the right trend, Jews less so.
I'm going to ask one of the questions from Zoom. How do you propose to deal with the Islamic religious reasons for the war against Israel as stated in the Hamas charter?
Well, I think what we need to do is, if there is a politically powerful entity living next door to us whose sworn goal is not only to destroy Israel, but to kill Jews, the lesson of October 7th is we can't let that monster get stronger and stronger. Had we taken action in 2008, when it was already clear what Hamas was doing, what they're trying to do, the price in terms of Israeli casualties would have been a fraction. And for the Palestinians of Gaza, the fact that we tried 5 times in different campaigns against Gaza and always tried to had this assumption that with Hamas, all we need to do is show them a little bit of force and they will be deterred. And that was the conception that fell apart on October 7th. So today, I, amongst the vast majority of Israelis, I think we're talking about 90%, and Arabs and Jews, who say Hamas must be destroyed. In the same way that America felt that the Nazis need to be destroyed, sometimes when there is an evil regime that threatens it, and we have 160,000 refugees that are Israeli now, not all Jews, some of them Arab, who can't go home because Hamas just yesterday sent more rockets into Israel, targeting civilians. Until that threat is removed and eradicated, we are not going to have peace in the region. Until that happens, moderate Palestinians are not going to be able to step up because they know what their fate is, because they have been systematically or whatever assassinated or physically harassed for any willingness to work with Israel.
So, my name is Ron Serbin, and your speech today or presentation is very rational to, I think, everyone of us in the room. And someone mentioned the Hamas perspective, but there's also other people in the world who have perspectives that are not rational like yours. And I bring this up, my daughter is a freshman at the University of California, Santa Barbara, so she's on a university campus, and she's heard people speak and say, well, Israelis or the Jews are colonizers. And when my daughter, who went to the Jewish day school here and who actually is not religious at all, said, well, in the Bible, it says that the Jews were here. And the person said, well, the Bible's a story. It's not a real story. So my question is, how do you rationalize with these the Islamic, you've already addressed, but other people who say that the Israelis are colonizers, or that the apartheid or so forth. How do you rationalize with people who
I'm working on that problem at Stanford, where I'm just came there. The very first day I was introduced to the mock refugee camp, which was set up by the Palestinian advocates across from the student union, which is fine. I'm all for freedom of speech. What I wasn't fine with was a lot of these kind of comments. And how much I wish I could take them to the Israel Museum to see, 2,000-year-old scrolls written in the same Hebrew that can be read today. I mean, we are a country, really, I think, which is prototypic indigenous people. I mean, we speak the same language as our forefathers 3,000 years ago. We read the same book of books that your daughter quoted in our synagogues and on our hiking trips. We look at the same landscapes as our elders do and can learn about them from that. And we go on and on. We enjoy the same wildflowers. It is so much of us that the history informs so much of our lives in Israel. And it is just intellectual bankruptcy that these kind of lies are not only perpetuated by, propagandists, the Palestinian, they're doing, their job the best they can, but by American academics, and not just American, Europeans as well, who in some sort of spirit of progressive lunacy are willing to forfeit any kind of critical thinking. The evidence is all there. You don't have to be a genius. You could go and read centuries of travelers who described there was always Jewish presence inside of Israel as well. We were unceremoniously, exiled by the Romans, but still Jews stayed there. Go to Pki'in, where there was a synagogue all the way through, and you could go down. So that's me letting off steam. That's not actually helping your daughter at all. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this time when I'm in the States is to go and meet with these groups and talk to them. I'm very impressed with what's happening at Stanford. So I'll tell you that story. Maybe that would be help, because if you give me her name, I'll have the students at Stanford be in touch with her, because not that far. At Stanford, for a week, the Jewish students were in shock, and the Israelis, there's a lot of Israelis in Silicon Valley, 100,000, and they also were in shock. There were marches through the campus, not necessarily with students, calling for to the river to the sea and against Jewish genocide, all this kind of stuff. And a interesting meeting place between high-tech entrepreneurs who are Israeli and Jewish students, and now not just American Jewish, but now Israeli students there, created right across from the Palestinian mock camp a blue and white tent, they call it there, which is, I think, is much better presented there. And although there's 4 or 5 on a good day Palestinian advocates, there are always a dozen or more Jewish students, community members come by, pulling in passersby and saying, and they open up discussions, having events. I'm supposed to talk about the environment there, and standing up, and the dynamics have flipped. And students at Stanford are starting to get the real facts. They can make their decision. They can hear the other side. But at least we need to be proud and stand up and say, you know what? We have a narrative too. I'm not going to tell them, and we should at least try to show them that our evidence is stronger when we talk about at least our own presence in the land of Israel. So if you want, I'll be happy to talk, because they probably have much more insights about how to do it in the actual organizational sense than I do. But I was been very, very moved by the courage of these young people who said, no, we're not going to be a victim anymore. We're going to stand up proud.
Hi, I'm Michael Lynn, and my question is related to the Gaza and occupation. So I'm very familiar with what happened. They pulled out in 2005. They got a ruling by the High Court in 2008 that they're no longer occupiers. But then the UN comes in and says, well, there's an exception for you. You're still an occupier. How do you deal with that? Because when you look at the facts and the logic, it's like, how do they get out of it? And to me, it's a financial question, really. The Hamas wants Israel to be called the occupier, so they're still liable for a lot of, financial terms or laws that apply to if you're occupier versus a non-occupier. So isn't there a certain level of wanting them to be?
I mean, I've mentioned my grandfather a lot today. It's an interesting thing. One of the things that always bothered me about him, he saw behind any criticism of Israel an anti-Semite. He would say, oh, I was a horrible anti-Semite. I would say, come on, get real. It's legitimate to criticize Israel. I was much more confident. But I find it troubling that a whole branch of academia is all good with nationalism unless you're Jewish. Then it's colonialism. Then it's evil. And when Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005 and handed the keys to the Palestinians, they could have done anything. They had so much financial support. Israel left them all the agricultural infrastructure. The Palestinians immediately looted it and destroyed it. Okay, they were traumatized. They went immediately and started digging 1,000, 200,000 wells, completely ruined the aquifers there. I mean, and their own groundwater thing, for whatever reasons, but we gave them the keys to do that, okay? And how did they spend the billions of dollars they've received over the years from Qatar and other ones? Did they build the environmental infrastructure, the Riviera that they could have done there along that coastline? No. Do you know that the London Underground, the subway, has 250 miles of track? And that's about half of what the Gazans built under Gaza. Only it wasn't to move people around, it was to create a killing machine. That leaving so many people destitute, hungry, and with the sole goal because of their single-minded hatred of Israel, that is one of the great tragedies of the Palestinian people, because it could have been different. It was supposed to be different. That was the idea when Israel walked away from the Gaza Strip. So is it a double standard? Of course, it's a huge double standard. And does it have something to do with Israel being a Jewish state? I'm afraid so. I was just at a meeting with the head of the Special Israeli Envoy for Anti-Semitism, Michal Kotler, is visiting the States, and I went there. And she was talking about this thing that happens on universities about diversity and equity and inclusion. So it's a whole department in universities, DEI, okay? And one of her goals is to get Jews included in those discussions, because right now they're not part of it. But if you think about it, Jews are 1.8% of the American population. 60% of the hate crimes, according to the FBI, not the ADL, 60% of the hate crimes are against Jews. If Jews were any other nationality, any other small minority group, you would think that university presidents would be putting bodyguards by their things. And yet we all saw what happened at the Congress. So there is a problem with that. And I think we need to call it out. And I hate to admit that maybe in several cases, my grandfather may have been right. Maybe things changed, maybe they did. But right now, I think this is the time to stand up and speak out when you hear those kind of double standards. Now, it's interesting, and of course, Egypt, which has been equally, most of the provisions to Gaza come via Israel, not by Egypt, and they got off the hook. It's very, very hard to flip the standards, because when you are stronger, the assumption is that you are the evil, one of the messages which I'm trying to say, it's possible to be strong and right, and not necessarily the wrong side. I wish I was a better communications expert, but this is a PR challenge which Israel has failed at so far. All of us have, perhaps, and we need to do better. So I appreciate you raising the point. I don't have a magic answer.
So the next question is actually from online, from Steve. I think his last name is Basile.
Hey, Steve.
You said Israel wants moderate leadership in Gaza. What about those who want more moderate leadership in Israel?
Well, I want more moderate leadership in Israel. So that's a low-hanging pitch. Boom. I mean, what happened in the last 3 months politically in Israel is astonishing. I say it's astonishing because I'm active in the Blue and White Party, which is a centrist party. It used to be a little center-left. Now it's a little more center-right, but it's strongly in the center. And what happened is 5 elections in a row, basically the country was divided down the middle. The reason why Israel has such a right-wing government is not because the voting shifted, it was because the parties couldn't get their act together. So if the Meretz and the Labor Party had merged and one of them and the Meretz Party had passed it, and if the Arab parties hadn't split up, Yair Lapid would be the prime minister today. There would be a 60-60 split, okay? That's what it was up until the October 7th. And after October 7th, things have changed. So my party, for example, Blue and White, we have 8 of the 12 seats in our present faction, which is called the National Unity Party, 8. In the New polls that came out yesterday, 37. So Israelis have woken up after 9 months of very, very divisive and powerful pushback against an attempt to basically eviscerate our legal system. And now after this incredible security failure by the right-wing government, whose whole raison d'etre is to be strong in security, the vast majority of Israelis, those who are on the moderate right as well, want a change. And the question is, will this government be willing to give back this option to the people? Now, I could be wrong. In December of 1973, there was a terrible Yom Kippur War, which until October 7th was considered to be the greatest single Israeli failure, security failure, and loss of, legitimacy of the intelligence. And so Golda Meir, she said, I'm bringing it back to the voters. And it was an October war, in the Yom Kippur War. In December, 2 months later, she had general elections. Soldiers were still in the battle. She got 52 seats. She almost got half the votes, okay? So it could be that if we have that election, Bibi Netanyahu will be reelected. But as of yesterday's polls, the Likud party's down to 16 seats. 37 to us. I mean, I could go to nothing, but there is a huge shift. I would say converging in the middle, maybe shifting a little on the right side, but I think a very strong desire for change. So I'm optimistic that we'll get it.
Okay, we're going to actually go a little bit longer than we initially had talked about because we have so many questions.
There's one in the front row.
And we have a bunch online as well. So I just want to, we have time and I want to get to people. So.
Another thing that's happening is what's happening in Judea and Samaria, and what do you think that's contributing to this whole balagan?
Well, Israel has, unfortunately, a very right-wing government. And when Prime Minister Netanyahu formed it, he gave enormous power and influence to some of the far extreme most right-wing extreme parties that Israel has ever seen. I mean, when Itamar Ben-Gvir from the Jewish Power Party would get up to speak in the Knesset, I walked out as an expression of my disgust with his racist perspective and ideology, okay? I would never even sit and listen to give a talk. I know it was an illegitimate view, it was beyond the pale. And now he's our minister of police, okay? So that is a concern because this has empowered a small minority of extremists who are in the West Bank. And I think it bodes badly for the future in terms of reaching some sort of a reconciliation. And I think that the sooner we get this government in and bring out one that will provide a modicum of law and order in the West Bank, we'll be better off. But in the long term, Israel's going to have to make some concessions in the West Bank. The Palestinians are going to have to make concessions. Twice there was a serious effort to do that. Once Ehud Barak at Camp David in 2000 laid down a plan. In 2008, it was Ehud Olmert who gave it to Condoleezza Rice. Both times the Palestinians were unwilling to accept it. They're talking about resolving the problems of the West Bank because of their insistence, for the most part, at least that's what they claimed, about demanding a right of return. But the right of return, for me, is tantamount to the erasure of a Jewish state. And to me, that's a non-starter. You don't start a negotiation by saying, I'm willing to negotiate, but only if you erase yourself from the map. That won't work. So we have to think differently about that now.
Hello, sir. My name is Archat Ocha and I am from India.
Where are you from?
I am from India.
Oh, okay, great. Welcome.
So as you might know that Israel enjoys like a tremendous support back in India, not only before October 7th, but also after that. We have similar problems as compared to like when you think about Israel's problem. And also when I think about Jewish community and the Hindu community, we are not as blatant and obvious in showing our faith. But you might have seen that it's a very, very difficult challenge outside of India or outside of Israel. The PR, the gentleman was talking about the PR, the Western media, it's very difficult to convince them otherwise. And I always try to have this meaningful conversation with people, but it's always like a lost cause where over here. So I'll come back to my question. My question is that how do you fight this PR war that the Western media, Al Jazeera, CNN, it's difficult.
It's hard. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't even seem to matter that much about CNN because first of all, I want to say that Israel is extremely grateful for the support that President Modi or Prime Minister Modi? President Modi has given us, I mean, he came to visit Israel for 10 days. This is crazy. The guy's got to run a country with over 1 billion people and he's spending so much time in Israel. But we were really honored that he came and did that. And then he hosted our prime minister in a reciprocal fashion. So I think there is a unique level of friendship between Israel and India, which didn't so much exist in the past. I know friends of mine who are very involved in irrigation. The largest Indian irrigation company bought the second largest Israeli one. So there's a lot of stuff, cooperation going in that respect. The truth of the matter is I'm critical of Israel's PR efforts, but I was privy to a survey that was taken this week about public opinion in the United States. And it says pretty much the following, that about 80% of Americans side with Israel, understand its need for self-defense, believe that Hamas should be removed, basically support President Biden's strong stance on that. Where is there not such support? Between the ages of 18 and 24, there it splits about 50-50. Every other, people over 60, it's 95%, okay? So where are we failing? We're failing amongst the young people. Now that concerns me because in 20, 25 years, they'll be running everything and we need to reach out to them. But it's clear that this is a generation that gets their news from non-conventional sources. And there's so much fake news out. And Russia's almost their delight in, messing with our minds and putting up. I was taught when we were running for the Knesset, when the first time I came on the list, we had a special expert come in and talk about fake news. And she said 55% of the news sites in the United States are actually run out of Russia. Okay. And several of them have been retweeted by, at the time, President Trump was the president. So we have to be aware that social media has such enormous influence on some people. And I think that we could all be a lot clever because social media is ultimately entertainment. So we have a very, I think it's a very, very clever satire show in Israel that everybody watches called Eretz Nehederet, a wonderful country. And they've had 5 or 6 English sketches, I don't know, but if they claim that over 150 million shares of their ones, not enough, we need to get to billions. But I think that's how we're gonna have to do it. We're gonna have to find ways to make the truth accessible, interesting, engaging, because it's a different ball game. I come from a different generation, so I'm not sure I have the answer. When I was in the Knesset, I was like, I just handed my social media accounts over to my young assistants and they did it very, very well. I mean, but I would sometimes say, really? They said, Alon, trust us. So I would like to trust that there's some very smart people in India, smart people, young people, and we have to get roll up our sleeves and get to work in that respect, just to bring truth out. Yes,
Great.
please.
Actually, I'm gonna do a couple questions from the Zoom and then I'll come back into the audience with the microphone. If we don't have you on the microphone, the people on the Zoom can't hear the question. So this is from Margaret Kennedy. She wants to know, why did other Arab countries not offer refuge to the Gazans as Western countries did for the fleeing Ukrainians?
Well, I think that this is a particularly sensitive issue. Let's remember that in 1948, the vast majority of Arabs living inside of the British Mandate of Palestine left. Now, there's different explanations for it. I think the Palestinians feel very strongly that they were thrown out. Israel feels that most of them left of their own volition. I imagine the truth is somewhere in the middle. I've read a lot of testimonials in both directions. But the point is that the Nakba, that mass migration of people, is a trauma which is locked into the DNA of the Palestinian people, and I respect that. And so for the very notion, I mean, at some point there were a couple of Israeli politicians said, Egypt should open its doors, let the Palestinians go to Egypt, we can clean out Gaza and they can come back. But that whole refugee dynamic was not one which was germane in the present case. So I think that the fact that they haven't, in fact, when the Arab countries met in Cairo in November, there was a meeting of all the heads of state in the Arab countries, and the radical countries demanded that Israel, that all other Arab countries cut their diplomatic ties with Israel, not let Israeli planes fly over their airspace, and all kinds of other things that they condemn in the UN, whatever. And almost across the board, the vast majority of the modern Arab countries pushed back, but on this issue, they waited, and the decision said there should be no Palestinians leaving. And I understand the sensitivities. The unfortunate reality is that there are 20,000 dead people in Gaza. There would have been far fewer if they, first of all, Hamas had let them move through the humanitarian corridor, not shoot at them when they tried to do that, because they were how should I put it? They saw the PR benefit in having lots of human shields getting killed. And that's sort of the cynical way that Hamas operates. But I think we all share a sense of horror, regret, and sadness at the number of civilian casualties. Notwithstanding, I think, as this has been a enormous proactive effort to avoid them. But obviously, that doesn't really help when you have lost your family member or a friend. So anyway, so that's the reason why it's there. I think this historic sensitivities which made it.
And then the next question, it's actually, there's two questions from the same person, but they're essentially the same question. It's from Gerald Weiner. And he wants to know, basically, he's saying this has been going on for 100 years, 100+ years. And how does it end? How do we get to a point where we're not going and having a fight every 10 years with a new war? And
I'm not sure I know the
so
answer.
how do we break the cycle?
How do we break
and
the cycle?
create a future for both peoples?
So look, to be an environmentalist, you have to be optimistic. Otherwise, why would you get up in the morning? The news could be so bad otherwise. And I would like to hope that this little difference is the Middle East is a changed place, and that the fact that there is now an alternative model of moderation, of accepting Israel and learning to work with that. If we can get the Palestinians on board with that, then maybe the Israelis can show the kind of flexibility we need to move forward and create a lasting solution. So I wouldn't think the situation is static. And we see that if the majority of Arabs living in the Middle East have willing to accept a Jewish state in the Middle East, it's time the Palestinians do too. And then maybe we really will be able to break the cycle, because that's what's going to take. It's what I started with. It's accepting our indigeneity, the fact that could be a Jewish state there, and that willingness to do that and to speak truth to that.
Great.
What do you think?
Other questions? I know other people are.
We have one
raising
right
their
here in the front
hands.
there.
My name is Odette Evans, and my question is, what is your response to people who said that the Irgun and the Haganah at one time were against, the power of the English people? And of course, they had attacks, and they feel that Hamas is compared to the Irgun and the Haganah. However, I say, what would have happened during or what is the treaty that was between the English people and the Israeli, if they had some kind, the Balfour Declaration, if there was an understanding that there could be two states at the time, because at the time it was a protectorate, right? And so in order to conquer, it seems the English people left a mess, and they didn't have really some kind of understanding between the two states at the time.
Okay, so first of all, I think you're asking two questions, Odette, so I'll try to deal with them. Any comparison between the tactics of the Haganah and the Irgun and those of Hamas are ill-advised, because I see them as completely different. The Haganah and the Irgun targeted British soldiers, and the Haganah usually facilities and infrastructure that were British, okay? Not civilians, never civilians, okay? When the biggest loss of lives by the Irgun was when they blew up a corner of the King David Hotel. They sent a warning that they're going to do that. I don't see Hamas sending a warning on October 7th. And the Hamas doesn't end up having, and the difference between them and this, when civilians get hurt or killed, that's a tragic collateral damage with Israeli. That is the goal of the Hamas. They came in and they provided, they drugged their soldiers and trained them and sent them on a mission of raping and saying, take pictures of yourselves so you can gleefully send it back, okay? The pleasure that they took in slaughtering innocent children, that's nothing that ever happened with a Jewish underground in those complicated times. Now, with the second question you asked had to do with, maybe you remind me so I can focus in on it.
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration.
So yeah, the truth of the matter is, if we talk a little bit of history, the British were stunned in 1947 when the United Nations said, you know what? Because we're going to take the mandate away from you. In 1922, the British get a mandate from then the League of Nations, what preceded the UN. And because there had been so much turbulence and they had failed in creating a two-state solution in the 1937 partition plan. They brought the issue to the UN. The UN created a special committee called UNSCOP, and they went to the Palestine. They met with both sides. And the British, I think, were, from what I've read, were pretty sure they were going to say, okay, you're going to continue running this with this. And they said, no, you failed. We're going to, it was after the Holocaust. There was a sense the Jews needed a real solution. And they said, we're going to create two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state side by side. And of course, we know historically the Jews accepted the partition plan, even though it was much less than they had thought they would get in the promise during the mandate, but they wanted something, and it was rejected by the Palestinians who tried to, basically destroy any Jewish presence there. So that is the actual history lesson. And so the British did leave a mess, but I think that's because they actually thought they weren't going to leave, and then when they did, they said, "Okay, what the heck," and they just walked away from it all.
I know there is no comparison, but at the same time, people should know that when the Palestine gets help, it seems like all the presidents that they have enriched themselves. As of today, I read that Arafat heiress has $100 billion. And all these people, I think, instead of helping the Palestinian from the help that they get from the UN and America and so forth, it seems goes in their pocket and in the tunnel versus helping the progress and the evolution of the Palestinian. And I think this is what the world does not understand.
I think
And that's what the media is really
I agree with
mean,
you that it's been, I
not
think,
talking about.
for 100 years, the Palestinians have not enjoyed smart, wise, and I would think honest leadership. And Arafat, I think, is an extreme case, but had, I believe, somebody who appeared on the scene who had the same kind of moral compass of a Nelson Mandela, the Palestinian destiny would have been different. And they have been cursed by a long litany of bad leaders. And that's part of their tragedy. And we could talk about links, but I don't pick Palestinian leaders. I just have to try to deal with them best we can.
Okay, Alon, I'm gonna draw us to a close with one last question from the internet that I think is a good final question. And this is from Jessie Goodsell, and she says, how can diasporic Jews advocate for sustainable peace and security for Israel and Palestinians?
What was the first?
Diasporic Jews.
Well, I think that in my world, the Palestinians will only get a fair shot at a reasonable future if the extremist Muslim leadership they have is moved off the stage. Until that time, reasonable people don't have a future. Women don't have a place at the table. Homosexuals, forget it. They get shot at the square. We know what's happened to them. So, to my mind, supporting the war in Gaza is not a war against Palestinians. Just 2 days ago, I think Israel's, at least my favorite singer in Israel, Idan Reichel, but certainly one of the most popular ones, said, from his perspective, the Palestinians in Gaza are hostages themselves. They're held captive by the Hamas. And I think that's how we see it, and that's part of the tragedy. So although it sounds, I don't know, even a little bit condescending, but I really do feel that in some sense, if this war resolves in the way that we hope it is, we will liberate the Palestinians to have a better future. And that's how I see it. If I didn't see it that way, I couldn't support it. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Happy Tu B'Shvat. Be well.